Welcome back. 2.2 million people lost their jobs in just 3 months this year. South Africa's official unemployment rate declined to 23.3% between April and June. It dropped from 30.1% in the first quarter. Stats SA warns that the unprecedented drop is not a reflection of an improving labor market, but rather an effect of the national lockdown. The lockdown hindered people from looking for work. The expanded definition of unemployment, which includes those who have given up looking for work, sits at a staggering 42%. It means 10.3 million people are unemployed. All right, let's get some analysis on this story. We're joined by Labour consultant Tony Healy, who joins us now via Skype. Tony, thank you so much for your time. I think generally there was an expectation that the job numbers for the second quarter would be devastating because of the impact of COVID-19 and that subsequent lockdown. But 2.2 million jobs shared is still a big number.
Good afternoon, Clement. Exactly right. I think what we've seen is a counterintuitive outcome. We would have expected the unemployment rate to have gone up. But what has happened, as you've rightly said, is the actual official limited or narrow definition of unemployment has gone down, because in order to be unemployed, an individual needs, first of all, to be available for work, and second of all, be able to look for work. And of course, with the national lockdown, neither of those have been possible. So we have the kind of strange anomaly of, on the one hand, an official unemployment figure reducing by 7% or so, but the reality is over 2 million jobs lost, and yes, north of 10.5, 11 million economically active South Africans out of work.
Yeah. So when you look at the expanded definition then of unemployment, is it correct then to say that it's possibly up by over 2%?
Look, in reality, it's so difficult because the definitions are so precise. But look, I would say that it's probably gone up by at least 5 to 6% in terms of the definition. But at the end of the day, I think one could get caught up in these definitions and how they work and what they mean. I think what's perhaps the most important statistic is that we are sitting with north of 11 million unemployed South Africans, which is by a country mile the worst in the whole world.
Yeah, and I imagine all the sectors, or at least most of them across the board, were affected.
That's right, and there wasn't any sector that was unaffected. The formal sector lost about 1.2 million jobs. Private households lost 300, 400 odd thousand, or 1 in 4 domestic workers lost their jobs. That's another way of looking at that. And every single sector dropped. And I think another important statistic that comes out of this is that we see the ongoing worrying increase in youth unemployment. So we're knocking on the door of 53% in the 15 to 24 age bracket, which is really terrible. And we mustn't forget, and we all know that going into the pre-COVID, we had a weak economy, we had a struggling economy, we were sub-investment grade, we had already pre-existing high unemployment, and it's really anybody's guess how we're going to ultimately be able to recover from this from an employment point of view.
Yeah. So the numbers are devastating, clearly. Something has to give. Where does government start? Where does it start to kickstart the economy and start creating job opportunities?
Well, I think there's probably no one silver bullet. I think there's a number of things that needs to happen, and also structurally in terms of issues. For example, and none of these factors on their own are necessarily a panacea, but I think, for example, kind of public works initiatives that require positions that are largely unskilled, largely labor intensive, that could help. Focusing already on industries which are labor absorbent, such as agriculture and the hospitality industry. And then, for a long time now, many of us have been saying that we need to some degree, deregulate our labor laws. We have a highly regulated labor environment. Some would argue that that's not the case, but the reality is, especially for SMMEs, hiring and firing is just laborious and expensive and time-consuming and risky. So many employers choose rather not to employ or to automate where they can. So to focus on, and perhaps tax breaks where possible. That's going to be difficult because all of the COVID relief we're seeing is really just being funded by future tax. But there's a few things that could be done. But we haven't, these are not new challenges. We've been sitting for a couple of decades, and we haven't seen the kind of structural changes we need to fast track employment. And I'm not particularly confident that even the current situation is going to make any difference.
And you would imagine that the current situation is going to prove to urge government to do something. And like you say, this has been spoken about many times before. And I'm interested to find out for you if you have any confidence that, the economic recovery plan, that document that was agreed at NEDLAC by all the various parties, business, labor, and government, how much of assistance is that going to bring? I mean, it's been agreed at NEDLAC, but it still needs to be rubber-stamped, and the details still need to be put out there by the President.
Look, it's a well-intended document, and I think there's a strong will to succeed as far as that plan is concerned. But, if we look historically at similar initiatives such as the NDP, we've just not seen execution. And that's what we need to see with this NEDLAC initiative. We need to see execution, and we need to see structural changes in a whole host of areas. A well-intended plan is one thing, but being able to execute in areas where we need regulatory reform, legislative reform, greater tax incentives, greater focus on perhaps labor-intensive industries and giving them more breaks in terms so we can promote employment in those industries. That all needs to happen, and it needs to happen fast. And unfortunately, we have a history of execution.
All right. Tony Healy, thank you so much for your time this afternoon on eNCA. That was, of course, a labor consultant, Tony Healy.